Alright everybody, welcome back to another Ask a Dev Unreal Engine tutorial. My name's Kevin. Today we are going to be taking a look at more 5.4 preview, specifically modular control rig. But we're not just going to drag and drop and create a modular rig. We are going to teach you how to make your first custom module that you can use with modular rigs as kind of like an icebreaker to the understanding of modular rigging. Also, this ties directly into questions that the community has had around the recent control rig videos, and specifically the functionification and proceduralization video that just came out. But what we're taking a look at here is everything we've been learning still 100% applies in a modular rig world. So now, going through all this without documentation or everything has been fun, so I'm hoping to help save you a bunch of pain and maybe kind of help with an icebreaker on your first simple module that you can use as kind of a template and stepping stone to your understanding. Now, as always, if you like what we're doing here, there are tons of ways you can help support the community. You can spread the word. We've got super thanks and super stickers. We have the Patreon. We have our Discord community. You can hop in, help answer questions. So any kind of support is appreciated. As always, huge shout out to the community. You all have helped make all this stuff happen, and I appreciate everything I learned from you. So with that, let's hop into Unreal Engine and take a look at our first custom module. All right, here we are in good old Unreal Engine, and what we are going to start with is we are going to start with creating a modular rig that we can use to test out our module on. So to do that, we just right click on Manny Simple, and also just to be clear, I'm starting with the third person template. So all of these character meshes are underneath the content characters folder. I'm going to right click on Manny Simple, I'm going to choose create, and I'm going to choose modular rig. Now, when we do that, if we take a look at our modular rig, by default, it starts off with the root. If you want to change the root, if you want to go full tilt on this, in order to do that, what you need to do is you need to go under your project settings. And if you type in root, you can see what the default root module is for all control rig stuff. You can actually create your own custom root. And if you change that, that will become the root module for all future modular rigs. Just something to know about. Now, as expected, the way that the modular rigging works is we have our root, it has a socket, and we're going to get into what these sockets are in a minute, how they get made, etc. But if I drag my spine onto this socket, you'll notice that it goes through and it creates all of the default controls for the spine, as well as it makes it so I can rotate my character with those controls. And it also sets up all of the additional sockets that I could use as part of the spine module. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to create our own custom FK control module that can be put on any joint in our character's hierarchy. How do we do that? Well, let's go and let's talk about a couple things. First thing you need to know is all of the default control rig stuff is over underneath our plugins. It's basically in our engine content plugins folder over here on the left, and if we scroll way down, we can get to our control rig content. Now, if we look at the modules under control rig content, you'll notice that we have the root. This is our base. We have a meshes folder. I'm going to talk about this in a second. And then we also have our control rig modules content in the modules folder. These are all of the default modules that are available to you out of the box. We are going to create a new one. Now, we could just duplicate that and start from there, and as long as it's a module, it will show up in the list. However, it's kind of cheating. Second, they're super complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on in here. And third, I want to show you all how it's good to understand some of the foundational parts of this stuff so you understand how these things work so you can create your own. Now, each of these modules was created off of a template. So the template, in this case, there's two different templates that are in here. There's the biped template and the chain template. We're going to use the biped template for ours. Generally speaking, and keep in mind we're doing this all without docs, so there's going to be lots of changes. This could be previewed, but generally speaking, I've been creating my modules based off the biped template because that's what I'm using them for. So in order to create our first module, we have to create a control rig actually. So let's right click on our biped template, create a control rig. And I am going to call this live FK control, just so we know that this is actually the one that I'm working on. And what's important to understand about this is, as long as it doesn't matter where these modules live, Unreal will find them. So I'm actually going to move this underneath the tutorial folder. So let's move that here. And then here we are in our tutorial folder. Let's just delete a couple of these. And here we have our live FK control. But you'll notice that the live FK control, even if I open it and compile it, save it, it does not show in the list. It's not here. So how do we get that to show up? Well, Unreal does not know that this is a module yet. So all we need to do is click one button. So if I switch this to a rig module, what is going to happen is a bunch of default stuff is done. First, we kind of get a root, and a whole bunch of other stuff happens in our graphs, but I'm going to compile and save this. And now that this is a module, if we take a look at our modular rig, you will notice that the live FK control shows up here in our modular rig. And if we go to drag it, look at what happens. As we go to drag, we can put this anywhere. We can put this on sockets, we can put this on bones, we have all kinds of options. And if we mouse over something that has a socket and a bone, we can choose the bone or we can choose the socket. I'm just going to choose the bone for right now. When I do that, you'll notice that it adds a live FK control to my modular rig, and it sets the connector information to be upper arm left. That is the bone that I drag and dropped it onto. So let's take a look at a couple of things. So in our live FK control, what I want to show you in our rig hierarchy, this root, this is our default connector. Now, if we change the rules for this default root connector, over here on the right, I clicked on the root, there's rules over here. If we set our rules, what we can do is I can add a type rule. And if I change this type rule to be socket, which is the default, what I want you to notice is compile and save. When I drag our live FK control, you'll notice that it only shows me the sockets. It doesn't show me the joints anymore, the bones. All right, so I drag and drop that. I missed it, set it to none. That's fine. I'm going to compile. Now, we want our first FK control to work with any bone. So let's go ahead and re-click on that root connector, and we can change the type on this connector to be bone. Now, in this case, what is going to happen if we compile and save that and we come back here, when I drag this onto my control rig, you'll notice that it's showing all of the bones. The sockets are no longer showing on these upper limbs. If I drag it onto here, you'll notice that my live FK control sets the upper arm as the connector info. Now, this is where we get into some of the wild stuff with modules. So here's what we need to do. We want to, just like they've done here with the spine and the root and so on, we want to spawn control. Well, there's a couple things we need to understand first. So control rig, if we look at our blueprint, you'll notice that we have forward solve, the construction, there's also a backward solve graph, but there's also another graph that we want to work with, and it's called the connector graph, or we're going to call it the connector graph. So let's call it the connector graph, event graph. And what this is if we right click, there is a new event called connector. This is the thing that does the work as you drag and drop modules around. And there's a lot of wild stuff that goes on in here, especially if you look through the other modules. But the general gist is, what we're doing is when you go through the action of dragging this onto a connector, what will happen is this information gets kind of stored into the slot. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Because we did not, by default, we only have one connector. We only have basically the parent, the root that we dropped it onto. But you can see here in these others, for example, the spine, they have a spine in bone, they had a parent control, they had a pelvis bone. How did they get all that to fill in? Well, what they did is they made other connectors. so that as you drag and drop, the connector is the one that does all of the work to find out whether it should be a socket, a bone, what it should connect to, information from previous modules, all kinds of crazy stuff. So in order to create a connector, all you do is right click and you can choose new connector. Now this new connector, I'm actually going to call this one, in this case, we're going to call this our primary joint. Primary joint. And what I'm going to do is I am going to set the primary joint not to be a child of the primary, but to be a type rule, and I want this to be a bone. All right, so that gives me a new connector. What I would like to show you now is if in our SKM Mani modular rig, if we compile this, when I drag my live FK control over to the shoulder now and drop it, you'll notice that my live FK control drops in, upper arm is filled in. However, the primary joint is none. How do we get that to fill in? This is the stumbling. This is us fumbling towards success, okay? So how do we get this primary joint to fill in? Well, let's just go ahead and delete this. Let's go back. I'm going to also, before we do the primary joint, I'm going to add one more connector. The reason I'm adding one more connector is because I want to show you an additional feature. This one is going to be called the secondary joint. And I'm also going to do the same thing here. I'm going to change my type rule to bone. Okay, and just like before, when I drag and drop, you'll see that I have two connectors. The bottom two are not filled in. They did not resolve. So let's go back and figure out how to make those resolve. So here we are. In our connector, what we need to do is we're going to, let's do a sequence here. So what you can do is we can get the connector and you can get connections in here, but this is only going to get the value. So that's not quite what we want. Now there's this wild thing where it's almost like this is an asynchronous thing that gets called a bunch. So what does that mean? It just means that when we drop it in, it's almost like this gets called for every single connector in your graph, that you've defined here in your graph. So there's this kind of wild thing that happens. Let me see if I can show you with another module. I'll show you real quick in the modules. If we take a look at the leg, for example, you'll notice in the connector event graph, they do this wild thing where what they do is they come in and they kind of call it resolve, and what they're saying is for the foot item, for all the possible candidates, if it's a match, set this default match. But there's nothing that indicates which item is the current one. So these are being created for each of the possibilities. So what we need to do is a similar thing. We're going to simplify ours a little bit, and we're going to do this twice. So for the first one, let's get the item. Is this the one? Yep, here's our item. Okay, and this is going to be a connector. And the name of our connector, it does fill in based on what we have. And in this particular case, we're going to use the primary joint. So what we want to do is if the connector is the primary joint, we're going to go ahead and set its value. So let's get the candidates. And from those candidates, if it's equal to the primary connector, if this is true, then we're going to set the value. And I'm going to create a sequence here. So this is the first one. So if this is true, then what we are going to do is we are going to set default match. If that's true, we're going to set the default match. Now, for our primary joint, in this case, what do we want to set our default match to? I want to set our default match to the joint or the bone that we dragged our module onto, which is held in the root. That's one way we can do it. So let's get that information from the root module, for root of this module, which gets set just by dragging. So what we're going to do is we're going to get the connection, and the connection we're going to get is we're going to get the root, and we're going to get that result and feed it in. So theoretically, when we drag our module onto our modular rig, it's going to go through and it's going to get the candidates. And if the connector equals the primary joint, then what it's going to do is it's going to get the information from the root. I'm going to skip sockets just in case, and it's going to set the default match for the primary joint. So let me just go ahead and show you that. Let's compile and save, and let's drop that into our rig. So theoretically, you'll notice that now our live FK control got dropped in, and the primary joint also got set to the upper arm, which is cool. However, let's go back and just try to wrap our heads around a little bit of this whole connection thing that happens. What if we didn't do this sequence? What if we didn't do this matching? Let's just go ahead for kicks and skip this right now. And all I'm going to do is just set the default match. This is what I'm talking about. If I set the default match, how do we know which connector we're setting the default match to? We don't. It's this wild asynchronous world where if we go to our live and we drop this onto the shoulder, you'll notice that all of my connectors are getting set to the root joint, which is not what we want. I wanted, for illustrative and tutorial purposes, to set the secondary joint to be the first child of the primary joint, just to make things interesting. So now that you understand why we can't just set the default match, this is what I mean by this is asynchronous. If the candidate connector is the primary joint, even though it's almost like there's nothing that sets it in here, this is where we're setting that first default match. All right, now we're going to do a similar thing for the for the secondary. So here's what we're going to do. Just like we did for our primary. And also, if you go through the existing control rig modules, you'll see all this stuff going on with for loops and everything like that. But this is the simplest form of setting the default match. So let's get an item. This time, the item that we're going to get is going to be the secondary joint. Okay, and we're going to get our candidates again. We can just copy them. And we're going to do the exact same test. So if these are equal, if they're equal, then what we're going to do is we are going to, whoops, I missed. We are going to set our information. Okay, and ultimately, we're going to be calling this set default match. Now, what are we going to set the default match for the secondary joint to? Remember, I said I wanted it to be the child. So to do that, just to make things challenging and illustrative, what we're going to do is we're actually going to get the child. From the connection, we're going to get the children, and we could get the item at 0. This should be the child. Now we should technically do some error checking here, like maybe if there isn't a child or it doesn't exist or it doesn't have one, but you know, I'm not going to worry about this. This is all about the connectors and trying to wrap your head around how these connectors work. So compile and save. Now let's go ahead and delete our live FK control, and let's drop this onto our shoulder. Now you'll notice, now that we've set this up, our upper arm, that's our base. Our primary joint is the upper arm again, but look at our secondary joint. Our secondary joint is now the low arm. This is awesome. This is exactly what we wanted. So this is how, from everything I found so far, all of the default matches are being set for any of the connectors that you are creating in your modular rigs that show up here that allow your end user, whether it be an animator or another rigger or whatever, to set these values as they're creating their little Lego legs or Lego rigs, which is really cool. Okay, so now that we understand how the connectors work, let's talk about how to use the connectors just like we've been doing in all of our control rig videos in order to set up an FK control that drives our shoulder. So let's do that. Okay, so let's go back to our live rig, And what we're going to do, now that we have our connectors, is we are going to set up our construction. Now, for our construction script, I'm going to do something once again to help explain what's going on. I'm going to create a new variable. This is going to be called our base joint. Our base joint. And this is a rig element key. Rig element key. And then I'm also going to create a second, a parent. Let's do a parent. The control parent. So we're going to create a control parent. And that is also going to be a rig element key. And then what we're going to do is we are going to set these values. So the first thing I'm going to do in my construction event is I'm going to go ahead and let's do a sequence. And I want to initialize this base joint. So I'm going to set the value of this. What am I going to set the value from? I am going to get the connection. And the connector I'm going to get is my primary joint, okay? And I'm going to set the base joint to be this value. And then now I can use this base joint all throughout my scripting and everything, but you can use this to get any bonus you want. And then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get the parent of this, and I'm going to set my control parent. And once I have done that, so far we haven't done anything visual yet. So now let's do the actual construction. Here's what I want to do. I want to spawn a control that is parented to the parent that is, we'll just take the default control for now. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to spawn a control. And where and how is this control going to be set up? Now, by default, we could set it to be in world space and parent into the root, etc. But for the purposes of this case, we're just going to keep it simple. We're going to parent it into the hierarchy, which is not what we would normally do. We would probably get the previous control, but again, just roll with me here. We're going to take our base joint, we're going to get our base joint, and I am going to take the name of this base joint, and I'm going to concatenate. Concatenate is just, once again, if you haven't been watching the videos, it's a fancy way to say add two strings together, and I'm going to put an underbar, let's say control on this. This is going to make CTRL, control. This is going to make the name of the new control that we are spawning. If we compile this, we have an error because we do need to have our initial value. So where is our initial value coming from? Our initial value is going to come from our base joint. So let's get a transform. Get a transform. Let's feed this into the item, and we can feed this into our initial value. Compile. Now, when we do that, we do have a bit of a problem or disconnect here. We have our global spaces and local spaces don't match. If I were to change these both to global space just for demonstrative purposes, when we come back in here, if we compile this, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of our mesh. You can see we already have a control. This is it. We already have a control. It's up here on our shoulder. However, if you take a look at our rig hierarchy over here on the right, you'll notice our up arm left control is not parented to the parent. So let's go back and do that. So here's our control, and what we're going to do is the control parent is going to be here. Now, here's the problem. When we do this, our rig is going to freak out. Actually, maybe not. Let's see if it is getting parented in. Oh, cool. So sometimes I have found that global space isn't really global space. So I've had to mess with this, but it turns out in this case, we are good, which is awesome. So we have our control parent, we have our joint, and if you'll notice in our hierarchy, our control is now parented to the clavicle. So wherever our shoulder goes, our control goes with it. That's what we want. Cool. Now all we have to do is the forward solve, and we're there. So let's go back to our newly created module, compile and save it. And in our forward solve, all we're going to do is the same thing we do with basic control rig stuff. So let's get our control, and we should probably store our control as a variable, but we'll just do this for now. Get the joint, concatenate, because this is about the modular rig. This is not about everything else. We're going to get the end of our control. And then what we're going to do is we're going to be setting the transform. So let's set transform. We're going to set the transform of the base joint, which in this case is our upper arm. We're going to be setting our transform to be the transform of the control that we just made. So let's get the transform of the control, and this is a control, and we're going to be setting this value. Now we do need to make one other change. Actually, maybe not. Something to keep an eye on is in our construction event, whether you're getting the initial value of the bone or not. So depending on, you just, in your own control rig setup, depending on whether your controls are in local space, parent space, etc., double check that you're getting initial value or not. In this particular case, I'm going to go ahead and set that. Maybe that is the thing that, nope, we're still good. Okay, great. So we're getting the value in, let's see, hold on, back to our forward solve. So here's our forward solve. So we're getting the control, we're getting the transform of the control in global space, and we're setting the transform of the bone also in global space. And let's go ahead and compile that, save that, and let's go back to our modular rig and see how we did. Look at that. So now what we've done is we have effectively created our very own and our first module that we can use with our own custom control rigs. So we basically just created our own custom module that all of our animators could use, or all of our riggers could use. Everything you've learned about control rigs so far all still applies. We still have forward solves, backward solves, construction scripts. Literally the only thing that changed is how the data works. So there's a little bit of a wrapper around our control rigs now, our modules, which is kind of all about the connectors. Once we understood how the connectors work, and admittedly they're a lot deeper, there's a lot more in here, there's a lot of different things that you can do as far as providing module settings, colors, propagating those down to each of the sub modules, getting the hierarchy. If you're brave and you dig into some of the existing modules that are in the preview, you can start to wrap your head around it. Hopefully this little intro will help you understand some of the basics about how all these connectors work, how to set some of the default values and so on. For all of the rest of the control rig series that we're doing, we are just going to make sure that we are building our control rigs in a way that we can very quickly transfer them to the modules. As always, thanks for being the best part of this entire experience. The community, I learned a ton from you all's questions. Once again, I probably wouldn't have even dug into this if the community hadn't asked. As always, appreciate all your help. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Take it easy.